There is a distinct type of silence that cuts deeper than any words ever could, the kind that comes not from an argument, not from a goodbye, but from sudden absence. No explanation, no closure, no trace, just gone. You try to replay the last conversation in your mind, dissect every interaction, grasp for some misstep that justifies their disappearance, but nothing adds up. You've been ghosted. And the emotional toll it takes is far from trivial. It triggers abandonment wounds, self-blame, confusion, and sometimes even obsession. But what if I told you that ghosting says far more about the ghoster than it ever does about you? Let's go deeper. To understand ghosting is to understand psychological avoidance at its core. Ghosting is not simply an act of detachment. It is a psychological defense mechanism employed by individuals who have, often unconsciously, built their emotional identities around escape rather than confrontation. It is not always done with malice. It is, at its roots, an act of protection. But protection from what? Pain, vulnerability, accountability. The ghoster's silence is not blank. It's loaded with the echoes of their inner chaos. For many, ghosting is their only way of maintaining emotional control. People who ghost are often deeply conflict avoidant, a trait rooted in early life experiences. Growing up, they may have been punished for expressing negative emotions or met with emotional neglect when they tried to open up. The nervous system of a ghoster is often wired to associate confrontation with danger. So when discomfort surfaces, whether it's emotional intimacy, perceived criticism, or internal pressure, they run. Ghosters tend to operate from a scarcity of emotional tools. Instead of expressing, they evade. Instead of explaining, they disappear. Instead of admitting confusion or fear, they choose the illusion of detachment. But make no mistake, their silence isn't strong. It's a symptom of fear. Ghosting often originates from unprocessed trauma. Childhoods where they learned that speaking up made things worse, that telling the truth meant punishment, that sharing feelings was either dismissed or weaponized. So now, as adults, their only safe response is to vanish. Yet, despite being the one left behind, it's you, the ghosted, who's left to carry the emotional weight. That's the most insidious part. Psychologically, ghosting activates some of our deepest primal wounds. Humans are wired for connection. In the tribal brain, to be cast out without explanation was a death sentence. So when someone disappears on us, especially someone we trusted or loved, it registers as a psychological threat. Our nervous system doesn't just process the silence as confusion, it processes it as abandonment. The brain scrambles for answers, not because it wants closure, but because it wants to survive. That's why ghosting feels so devastating. It's not just a missing text, it's a severed lifeline. And without a cause, the mind manufactures one. It must be my fault. This is where the self-destruction begins. Being ghosted causes many people to internalize shame. If you already had attachment wounds, ghosting compounds them. It reaffirms the belief that I am too much, I am not enough, or I am disposable. In this way, the ghoster unknowingly reactivates old emotional injuries within you, regardless of their intent. But ghosters aren't one-dimensional villains. Some of them are highly emotionally intelligent in other aspects of their lives. They can be charismatic, articulate, even nurturing, until emotional tension surfaces. That's when they disappear. It's not that they're incapable of affection. It's that when their internal capacity to handle vulnerability gets maxed out, they pull the plug to regain control. And the more they've been praised or rewarded for detachment in the past, the more likely they are to use it again. Many ghosters were subconsciously taught that their absence holds more power than their presence ever could. So they leverage silence as a form of dominance, not necessarily to harm you, but to protect the fragile scaffolding of their own identity. Some ghosters were raised in emotionally enmeshed environments where boundaries didn't exist and separation felt like betrayal. In adulthood, the pendulum swings in the opposite direction. They cut ties abruptly to protect the fragile sense of self they never got to develop in a healthy way. Others were raised in chaotic households where relationships were unstable and love was conditional. To them, cutting people off isn't cruel, it's survival. But there's a darker subset of ghosters, those with narcissistic traits. For narcissistic or manipulative ghosters, disappearing is not just a response to discomfort. It's a calculated form of control. They love bomb intensely in the beginning, mirror your values, draw you in, and then leave without a word. Why? Because it makes them feel powerful. Because they know your nervous system will collapse into anxiety and confusion. Because when they disappear, they become the object of obsession. And obsession is attention, even in absence. These ghosters return as suddenly as they left, often under the guise of just checking in. But in reality, they're testing your boundaries, seeing if you'll let them back in without accountability, seeing if their silence still has power over you. This cycle, idealization, ghosting, reappearance, is a common trauma bond, one that keeps people addicted to inconsistency, longing for crumbs of connection from someone who only gives when it benefits them. And each time you allow them back in, the ghosting wounds deepen, not because you're weak, but because your brain is seeking resolution to something that was never meant to make sense. But not all ghosters return, and that too needs to be understood. Some ghosters cut off communication permanently because they feel overwhelmed by the emotional responsibility they sense is forming. The intimacy becomes too real, the expectations too heavy, and instead of expressing their emotional limits, they escape the relationship entirely. Often, they tell themselves it's kinder to vanish than to explain, but that is a lie told by the emotionally underdeveloped to justify their lack of courage. Communication takes courage. Silence takes nothing. For the person ghosted, the remedy lies not in getting closure from the ghoster, but in reclaiming the power of your own narrative. Because what hurts most about being ghosted is not the silence itself, but what you tell yourself that silence means. And what it means is this: they were not ready. They didn't have the tools. Their silence was a reflection of their inability, not your unworthiness. This is where the healing begins. It's easy to turn the ghosting into a referendum on your self-worth. But the deeper truth is that ghosters often carry invisible burdens that have nothing to do with you. Their disappearance is not your deficiency. It is their avoidance. It is their fear. It is their lack of emotional maturity. And as painful as it feels, it is better to be ghosted by someone who cannot communicate than to be bound to someone who never could in the first place. You must resist the urge to chase explanations that will never satisfy your inner child. Because the one waiting for answers is not just you. It asks the version of you that was once abandoned, once dismissed, once made to believe they had to earn love to keep it. And so, when you're ghosted, it's not just the current silence that hurts. It's the chorus of past abandonments that suddenly grow louder. The father who left and never called again. The mother who emotionally withdrew during your breakdowns. The friend who vanished when you needed them most. Ghosting reopens all of it, even if the person who left was never that significant on paper. Because the nervous system doesn't measure the weight of a connection based on time. It measures it based on emotional meaning. And sometimes the smallest flickers of closeness trigger the deepest wells of pain. But here's the darker truth. The ghoster often walks away clean. No explanation owed, no discomfort faced, no pain endured. Their silence becomes their shield. Meanwhile, you're left to hold both the grief and the guilt. And if you're the type who grew up managing other people's emotions, you might even start rationalizing their behavior while abandoning your own pain. You might say things like, maybe they were busy, or maybe they were going through something, or maybe I came on too strong. But notice what you're doing. You're outsourcing your peace to the fantasy of closure. You're trying to rewrite the silence into a story that hurts less. Because the idea that someone could simply discard you without a second thought is too heavy to carry. So you carry their story instead. This is how ghosting turns victims into self-blamers, into over-explainers, into trauma-bonded seekers of approval who rather chase the validation of the one who left than face the grief of being left at all. And here's the paradox. Many ghosters were ghosted themselves. They know this pain. They just never developed the capacity to face it. So instead of breaking the cycle, they become what they once feared, the one who vanishes. But repetition is not healing. Repetition is avoidance disguised as control. And every time they ghost, they deepen their own emotional numbness. They shrink their capacity for real intimacy. They reinforce the very loneliness they're trying to avoid. Because here's what no one tells you about ghosters. They're haunted too. Haunted by the emotional debts they never repay. Haunted by the intimacy they destroy before it gets too real. Haunted by the masks they wear to seem unaffected while secretly longing to be understood. But they cannot show that side, because to show it would be to break character. And their whole emotional identity is built on the illusion of indifference. This is why ghosters rarely reach out with genuine accountability, because that would require them to confront the part of themselves they've worked so hard to avoid, the part that feels, the part that cares, the part that is still wounded and waiting to be seen. Ghosters fear vulnerability, not because they're incapable of it, but because their nervous system has learned to associate it with annihilation. In their world, to explain is to risk exposure. To express is to lose control, and so they flee. But no one escapes their own patterns forever. Eventually, ghosters become emotionally bankrupt. Their connections lack depth. Their relationships become transactional. Their silence becomes louder than any truth they could ever speak. And while they may appear unaffected on the surface, the internal emptiness compounds. Because human connection, at its core, requires confrontation, requires presence, requires the ability to say, "This is hard for me, but I won't run." And those words are foreign to the ghoster, but they don't have to be foreign to you. If you've been ghosted, the path to healing begins with reclaiming your voice, with recognizing that you don't need someone else's explanation to validate your experience. You were hurt. That's real. You were left without closure. That matters. But your worth is not determined by someone else's ability to face you. It is defined by your ability to face yourself and to sit with the discomfort without turning it into self-hate. You have to rewire your own nervous system to stop chasing disappearing acts. You have to confront your own attachment wounds, your own fears of abandonment, your own compulsion to explain yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Because every time you do that, you reinforce the belief that you are the problem, and you are not. Being ghosted is a form of emotional violence cloaked in silence. But your healing does not require the ghoster's return. It requires your return to self-respect, to boundaries, to the deep, unshakable truth that you deserve to be chosen by someone who stays even when it's uncomfortable. And if you're the one who ghosts, or has ghosted, ask yourself why silence feels safer than expression. Ask yourself why disappearance feels easier than accountability. What story did you learn, and when, that made you believe communication would only make things worse? Who taught you that escape was your only form of power? Because here's the truth that could set both ghosters and the ghosted free. Real power is presence. Real courage is emotional responsibility. Real connection is built not when things are easy, but when we choose to show up anyway. So the next time you feel the urge to vanish, ask yourself, what would it cost me to stay? What would I have to feel, admit, confront in myself? And then ask, what would I gain by breaking the cycle? Because in that question lies the chance to become someone different, someone braver, someone honest, someone whole. You're not weak for wanting closure. You're human. But the most radical act of self-respect is realizing you don't need their explanation to heal. You need your own permission to move forward without it. And the final truth? The ghoster's silence may have hurt you, but it cannot define you. Only you get to do that. And your voice, your presence, is louder than their absence will ever be.